Today I want to try out one of the most efficient tweaks available to achieve a significant frame rate boost in VR, and that is vertical cropping. By limiting the vertical field of view in VR, you are essentially rendering less pixels to the panels, giving you a performance boost. We're going to try this and benchmark the results in 5 different VR racing simulators. Because yes, in my opinion, this tweak is only useful in racing sims and racing games, and I will explain why in a moment. But let's start off with the benchmark results and the frame rate numbers. Then I'll briefly talk about how I did it, if this approach is worth it, and if cropping the vertical field of view introduces any downsides in racing simulators. Remember, the sole purpose here is to show you the frame rate difference by only lowering the vertical field of view while keeping, or forcing actually, roughly the same horizontal resolution. We will start off with Automobilista 2. In all these racing simulators, by the way, I have tried to max out the graphical settings to the point where a stable frame rate of 90 frames per second is not achievable with the Dream Air and my RTX 4090. As you can tell, I'm running Dream Air Lighthouse version with the native SteamVR driver from SBoys3 and its custom headset software using default Dream Air profile. In the first run, I'm running the default resolution, SteamVR at 100% and the default field of view of 100 horizontal degrees and 86 degrees vertically. Yes, we know that the Dream Air can render a wider field of view, especially horizontally, but with the current version of the native SteamVR driver from SBoys3, this is what we can achieve. Running the default field of view, the frame rate hovers between 70 and 80 frames per second. Fully playable, but not so smooth, to be honest. You can of course fix this with motion smoothing, but we keep that option disabled for now. We want to see the raw performance, of course, without cheating, so to say. Now let's try the same run with a vertical field of view of 60 degrees. Why 60, you may ask? I will explain that in a moment. It may sound ridiculous running VR with only 60 degrees vertically, but believe it or not, in racing simulators specifically, that narrow field of view on the vertical side is hardly noticeable and never distracting really. Alright, with essentially the same horizontal resolution, same sharpness, same clarity and pixel density, plus identical in-game settings, we are now playing Automobilista 2 in stable 90 frames per second. Hardly any frame drops at all, and it feels so much smoother now. Going from an average of around 74 frames per second to stable 90 gives a massive improvement of the VR immersion. It's a kind of a night and day difference in my opinion. Okay, now let's try Assetto Corsa Competizione. I have made sure that the game runs the latest DLSS 4.5, it looks super sharp without noticeable aliasing, and the SteamVR is set to 100% while the horizontal resolution is around 4000 pixels per eye. I have enabled pretty high in-game settings and my RTX 4090 is struggling again, so we are bouncing between 70 and 80 frames per second throughout the lap. Sometimes above 80, but on average 75 frames per second. The GPU frame times are above 12 milliseconds and therefore the GPU is the bottleneck. Cropping the vertical field of view from 86 degrees to 60 degrees brings us to a completely smooth 90 frames per second in the beginning of the race. But right around the first corner, we see that the frame rate drops down to mid-70 again. But also have a look at the performance graph in FPS VR. It's not even the GPU maxing out, it's my CPU, my ancient Ryzen 9 5950X that clearly shows its weak performance here. But note that the GPU frame times are still between 9 and 9.6 milliseconds, so there is still plenty of headroom up to 11 milliseconds, which is a maximum to keep the frame rate at stable 90 frames per second in VR. So what we see here is that the average GPU frame times went from 12 and above down to 9.5, which should keep our frame rate locked at 90 frames per second as long as the CPU is not the bottleneck, which it is in this example. Some of these racing simulators are very CPU demanding, and ACC or Assetto Corsa Competizione is in fact one of the most CPU heavy native VR titles that exist today. Either way, a big performance boost here again just by cropping off 26 vertical degrees in total. Now let's try Assetto Corsa Rally. Obviously, this is not a native VR game, but a very playable and amazingly beautiful VR experience when injected with a UE VR or Unreal Engine VR injector supporting 6-degree of freedom tracking and perfect 3D stereoscopic view. I enabled the latest DLSS 4.5 to completely remove jagged edges, and I kept the graphics settings pretty high. The framerate is, at least in the beginning of the race, mostly at 50 up to maybe 55 frames per second, which is pretty playable. Further into the race, the framerate drops further. Also, my CPU is choking and contributing to additional frame drops down to between 40 and 45 frames per second into the race. But the main bottleneck is still the 4090 graphics card at this resolution, with a frame time almost always between 20 and 22, sometimes even hitting 23 milliseconds. Okay, so after cropping the field of view to 60 degrees, we now see a frame rate of 55 to 60 frames per second on average. Still bottlenecked by the GPU and the CPU for that matter, but the game runs considerably more smooth now. We are rarely below 55 frames per second and sometimes going above 60, a very big performance boost actually compared to before. And yes, if you want to enjoy this simulator completely feeling smooth, like in 90 frames per second, you simply enable SteamVR motion smoothing. As a side note, SteamVR motion smoothing works great with all these 5 racing simulators I'm trying today. Significantly better than with Pimax Smart Smoothing. But that's not what we're here for today, right? So let's disable motion smoothing again and let's continue. Next up, I tried Le Mans Ultimate with MSAA at 4 and very high in-game settings to make the game look beautifully sharp. Again, already at the beginning of the race, we see the CPU bottlenecking this simulator, while the GPU frame times stay mostly below 10, which is okay. We see the frame rate jumping all over the place. Sometimes smooth 90 frames per second, but many times down to 80, 70 or even 60 frames per second. This is also probably because I'm having pretty high difficulty here, introducing more complex physics that are driven by the CPU. By cropping the field of view to 60 degrees vertically, we do in fact see the frame rate increase overall, and the frame times are definitely lower. But in my example, my Ryzen 5950X CPU is really the big bottleneck, so we see very similar frame rates on average throughout the whole Circuit de la Sarthe track. To prove that the cropped vertical field of view is in fact efficient, we can look at the frame times during the same part of the track where the frame rate is at 90 frames per second in both examples. Here, we went from a GPU frame time of between 7 and 9 milliseconds down to around 6 and occasionally even below 6 milliseconds. Lastly, let's try something less CPU bound, the original Assetto Corsa. I have maxed out the in-game settings, including post-processing, but when running SteamVR resolution at 100%, I'm still at locked 90 frames per second, which isn't optimal for this test, obviously. So I bumped up the SteamVR resolution to 150%, having a horizontal resolution of almost 5000 pixels per eye instead of 4000 as before. This brings the GPU down to its knees, and now we see an average frame rate of 70 to 75 frames per second, which is perfect for this test. By lowering the field of view from default 86 to 60 again, we can clearly see it helps a lot. Apart from some occasional frame drops, of course, we are literally locked at 90 frames per second now, while keeping the same pixel density as before at almost 5000 horizontal pixels per eye. The field of view crop gave a huge boost here, especially since the GPU is always the bottleneck in this title. So in all these 5 racing simulators, the vertical crop did improve performance dramatically, as long as the CPU is not bottlenecking the game in the first place. We tend to gain at least 20 to 25% higher frame rate, sometimes even above 30% even, looking at the GPU frame times. And no wonder really, if you think about it. We are in these examples, cropping the field of view or the vertical field of view by around 30% from 86 down to 60 degrees, which means also that we are rendering somewhere close to 30% less pixels per eye. In all examples where we ran SteamVR at 100%, the total resolution render per eye went down from 13.5 million pixels down to almost 9 million pixels per eye. So, to achieve this with the custom headset software, simply lower the vertical field of view slider down to 60. Then in SteamVR, adjust the resolution down to around 66% so that the horizontal resolution per eye is kept roughly the same. This means only the vertical resolution is lower than before, maintaining the same pixel density but over a narrower vertical area. I actually asked SBoys3, the creator of this native SteamVR driver, and he told me this is the correct way of doing it to maintain identical clarity and pixel density while cropping the vertical field of view. If you prefer running VR outside of SteamVR with other OpenXR runtimes such as Pimax OpenXR or Pimax XR, you can do similar thing with vertical crop using OpenXR Toolkit and a crop to field of view mod by OnSpeed, and it will give you roughly the same performance boost because it works the same way. And I made you a separate video for that tool later on because it has some additional cool features. But meanwhile, check the link in the video description. So here comes my own thoughts about this. Does cropping the vertical field of view really help with performance? Yes, obviously it does. We render fewer vertical pixels per eye, and with high-end headsets like the Dream or the Crystal Super running at ultra-high resolutions, we're normally always maxing out the best GPUs on the market. This could even be a game changer for you, allowing you to finally reach stable 90 frames per second in your favorite racing game, because going from, let's say, 75 frames per second to a stable 90 frames per second is a night and day difference if you ask me. But yeah, there is a catch. I wouldn't use this for anything else than racing simulators. While you're looking outside through the windshield 99% of the time while racing, going down in vertical field of view is hardly noticeable. Really, I mean it. It doesn't take any immersion away at all. In fact, the vertical field of view of what you actually see outside of the windshield is maybe 35 or 40 degrees at max. With only 60 degrees vertically now in VR, you're still seeing the entire windshield, the dashboard, the rear view mirror, the side mirrors, and the steering wheel in front of you. The only time I really noticed the smaller field of view was when I lost the left door in Assetto Corsa Rally after a crash. The daylight coming in made it pretty obvious that the view was cropped. And I did choose to specifically test 60 degrees vertically because I personally think it's a good starting point using Dream, giving you a big performance boost while you're still not cropping off too much. From there, you can of course elaborate and go even further or stay more conservative at maybe 70 degrees. I personally wasn't thinking about it at all when racing at 60 degrees, and I much rather prefer having a high resolution or better frame rate rather than some extra field of view on top and the bottom. But I don't know, what do you think about this? Are you cropping the vertical field of view when you're doing sim racing, or is that too distracting for you? Let me know what you think in the comments down here below. That's all for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.